Good morning, everybody. This is the Bethesda Downtown Design Advisory Panel meeting for June 24th. This is the second item, the Avondale. This meeting is being recorded, and the recording will be placed online with the notes after the meeting. The flow of the meeting will be able to, I will conclude my brief introduction, turn the presentation over to the applicant, and then the panel can discuss. As this is a sketch plan application, the panel will either decide that they would like to see the item again at sketch plan, or they can decide that they are satisfied that it is on track to meet the minimum 10 design excellence points and will not need to see it again until site plan. I will ask folks who have their cameras on to turn your cameras off, just to sort of help with bandwidth. And then once the presentation is on the screen, you won't be able to see the camera anyway. Sandy, are you able to turn your camera off? We love seeing your smiling face, but we want to make sure that we don't have bandwidth issues. Okay, so thanks very much. This is the Avondale. This is a sketch plan application. So we are focusing primarily on conformance with the design guidelines in terms of building massing and urban design. But this is also an opportunity to raise other issues that may be more detailed in nature to be addressed at site plan, but our primary focus is on massing and urban design. So with that, I will turn it over to the applicant to make their presentation.
Great, thank you all. This is Brett Swiatoka with Perkins Eastman. We're the architects for SJ Investment Corp on this project. Also on the line from the applicant team is Kevin Park, the CEO of SJ Investment Corp, Suli Cho with Miller Canby, and Pat LeVay with MHG. They're the civil engineer and landscape architect on the project. I'm going to share the screen now. Hopefully you all can see that now. You can confirm. If you can't see it, let me know.
We can see it.
Great.
We can see it.
Great. So the project that we're talking about is at 4526, 4530 Avondale Street. Let me go to full screen here. Project is located about 200 feet east of Wisconsin Avenue off of Avondale. Avondale is currently a dead-end street terminating down at the bottom of the hill here, and the project is located 2 properties in from Wisconsin Avenue. Obviously walking distance from the amenities of downtown Bethesda, including all the transit options, and the design and approach to the development of this project is really focused on downtown Bethesda as being the real amenity for the project, and is part of guiding the target tenant that SJ Investment is trying to attract. They do anticipate the units in the building being on average on this smaller size, attracting probably a population of young professionals that will either be working in downtown Bethesda or kind of other points in Maryland, or perhaps into the district with the transit options that are available. So as part of that, there's kind of anticipation that the group that will be attracted will potentially be used to not having a car or be open to not owning a car, and as such, the parking in the project is limited. but there is one level of below grade parking. The site, as you all, I'm sure, are familiar, because of its location, has access, 4 minutes walking to the metro station, a number of bus line options. The new Marriott headquarters is going to bring a working population here that will be looking for housing options. And then obviously the restaurants, retail shops, coffee, the neighborhood amenities that everybody would be seeking are accessible from the site location. This a zoomed in look here, you can see that dead end condition terminating at the school off of Wisconsin. And the existing property survey that we're talking about here is these two buildings that currently exist. Currently two-story structures, multifamily rental on the block. The rest of the block on both sides of Avondale, with the exception of the corners where we have Pumphrey Funeral Home, are also two-story rental buildings, rental multifamily buildings with 4 to 6 units in each building. Some views up and down Avondale Street of those existing structures, all of a very consistent articulation. Those two-story structures, walk-up apartments. The site has been upzoned, rezoned to CR on the south side of Avondale, allowing up to 70 feet, and CR 1.5 and up to 70 feet. And the project, the proposed project, is looking to maximize the density on the site within the realm of what's reasonable for the context, to increase the housing options that are available within walking distance and proximity to the amenities of downtown Bethesda. Just some more excerpts from zoning indicating the recommendations for the increase to the change to CR 1.5 and the increase in height to 70 feet. The project is proposing, it's approximately a 55,000 square foot building that's being proposed with approximately 60 units and 15% MPDUs, seeking 33,121 square feet of BOS density. And certainly, if there are any questions about any of this, feel free to ask. These illustrations diagram the different methods of FAR density on the site, standard, mapped, optional plus BOS, and then also showing that optional plus BOS density articulated as we've been proposing the project. This is just illustrating the height that's been allowed in the zoning for Avondale Street. You can see the 70-foot height allowed over the length of Avondale, with the increased height at the corners where the Pumphrey Funeral Home is currently located, up to 110. And then south of the site, we have where the Chevy Chase towers are located, allowing up for 240 feet and then 290 at the corner, and the Chevy Chase building's already currently maxing out approximately that 240 feet. So you can see in this view and a couple of the other views, the transition, kind of stark transition down from that 240 feet down to the currently existing two-story structures, and how that 70 feet of height allows what we think is the intent to create a transition zone down from that higher and taller density to the more residential scale of Bethesda. From the design guidelines, this is a neighborhood residential street with a building placement of 20 to 25 feet from the street curb, and the building form recommendations of a 2 to 3 story base with a step back of 15 to 20 feet of height, and we'll illustrate for you how we are or are not, in some cases, meeting those recommendations, but are proposing alternate approaches. So this is really illustrative existing context, just to show you in kind of the same scale and views how the proposed design works into the existing street. You can see from various angles those two-story structures with the 240-foot tall Chevy Chase Tower behind them, and Pumphrey Funeral Home here at the corner. This it is taking a pure translation of those building form guidelines from the downtown plan design guidelines, with the 2 to 3 story base, in this case 3 stories, showing it as 3 stories, the 20 to 25 foot setback from the curb, 15 to 20 foot setback above that 3 story base, and then the remainder of the building climbing vertical above that base. The next series of drawings will show an evolution, kind of how we've approached the design, starting with that base massing approach. We're showing the building set back from the west property line. This is the face of the building that will be located toward Wisconsin Avenue. It will be what we anticipate as the most visible face, with exposure from the traffic and pedestrian vehicular along Wisconsin. And with Avondale being a dead-end street, we don't anticipate as much movement and traffic and visibility for the east facade as you're moving from points east on Avondale to Wisconsin. Because the project, because of its location with a single existing development located between the site and the kind of the Pumphrey Funeral Home, which is a very active location. The design development team felt as though the likelihood for redevelopment of perhaps a similar scale is likely to occur at points east, and as such, the impact of a 0 lot line condition would be lessened by the fact that we anticipate in the future the idea that there will be taller buildings of similar scale to what we're proposing here. We looked closely at the 2 or 3 story base relationship and felt strongly that the 2 story base was much more appropriate for the scale of Avondale Street, given the existing context at 2 stories consistently on both sides of the street. And so we've been proceeding based on a 2 story base. We also looked at the kind of relative proportion and face dimension of the existing structures, and felt as though a continuous face tower and base for the building was considerably out of scale with that existing context. And so we looked at kind of a significant gesture of splitting the mass into what would read as kind of 2 linked towers, as opposed to 1 continuous face building. And I think what that starts to do is establish a reading of almost 2 story pavilion type structures that are similar in scale to the language, or similar in scale to those existing buildings, the 2 story structures on either side and across the street. To kind of emphasize that 2 story articulation and to limit the apparent face of the tower, we also looked at changing the expression with kind of a reveal, change in material, slight change in plane between the 2nd story and the 4th story. So the the third story becoming a different expression to emphasize that base and reduce the kind of appearance of the face of the tower, as we'll refer to it, that extends above the base. And then the refinements to the massing really come from what it takes to make the unit layouts and unit depths work inside the building. And that's where we're proposing a step back above the base that is less than the 15 to 20 feet that is found in the design guidelines. It's currently proposed at 8 feet, an 8-foot setback above the base, an additional foot at that third floor at 9 feet, and then the setback in the slot that creates the link between the two towers is currently expressed as a 3-foot setback. We are also proposing that the lobby of the building would extend beyond the 20 foot build-to line, closer to the curb by approximately 5 feet, in order to create a scale for the building that is at more of a pedestrian scale. It would be a very porous element signifying the entrance to the building and creating a special articulation for the entrance. Part of that extension also has to do with getting the entrance to the building located within the fire access operating bay, distance from Wisconsin. With a dead-end street, there are some challenges to creating fire access to the site that we've had to consider very carefully. And then we are proposing that the east facade of the building, as I mentioned, will be a 0 lot line condition. The depth and size of the site is limited such that it makes it challenging to create a functional building that is economically viable while maintaining a setback from the property line on all sides. And so our approach to kind of biasing or giving preference to the Wisconsin Avenue elevation, setting that back from the property line allows us the opportunity to introduce windows and fenestration on that Wisconsin facing side and create that separation while anticipating future development that will be occurring east of the project over the length of Avondale Street. These are views just isolating, removing the diagrammatic elements just so you can see the building proposed massing from the different angles. An aerial view from the northwest, you can see that lobby pop out. This would be an element that is visible at a pedestrian scale as you're moving down Avondale Street. You can see the articulation of the pavilion, the 2-story pieces at the base of the building, the separation of the tower to accentuate that lower 2-story base, and the slot in the building that then creates the expression of kind of 2 linked towers. Aerial view from the northeast. And you are seeing here that 0 lot line condition that we're proposing on the east elevation of the building, and then a view from the southeast with, again, a similar expression to the front, to the Avondale side of the project. In this case, though, potentially extending the slabs across in order to kind of shade the glazing that would occur in that separation between the towers and shade the glass in that element. Some of the precedents for materials and fenestration that we've been looking at, the articulation of a base of the building that would be a textured material with large openings in order to activate and create an active pedestrian environment along Avondale Street. And then perhaps windows that start to express largely as you'll see in some of our later drawings as kind of punched windows that we can utilize frame elements in order to create additional layering and depth. The perhaps introduction of Juliet balconies at these locations, at some of the locations, in order to create activation on the street and give people access to kind of ventilation and views and being able to kind of occupy that zone overlooking Avondale Street. Well, you know, we do know that we're only at sketch plan and that this is really a look at massing. We felt that the project is the approach to the project is a very simple approach from a massing standpoint, which we felt was appropriate for the scale and existing kind of character of Avondale Street. We have started to look at developing the facades because I think the development of the facades help give a sense of the scale of this project, and as opposed to the very simple massing. I think this helps articulate and helps we thought would help everybody understand how the building would be working in the context, perhaps with a little more detail than the massing would typically show. And so these are some views. You can see how the aerial view from the north in the context of the Chevy Chase Towers, the 70-foot height is in many ways a more appropriate kind of step down in height and density from the taller towers that are existing south of us in the Chevy Chase Towers, and the height that is existing across Wisconsin Avenue with potential taller height also allowed here at the corner of Avondale and Wisconsin. An aerial view from the southeast. You can see that the change in expression material to a more floor to ceiling glass expression accentuates that split in the massing. And this kind of similar articulation occurring at that third story condition that we were talking about. We've also looked at the articulation of the windows with varying mullion depths and frame depths that do help create additional layering and shadow and depth of expression on the facade. In this scenario, what we've looked at is those larger windows really occurring and anchoring the corners of the two kind of tower expressions in order to accentuate and develop a rhythm on those facades. And here's a view at that pedestrian scale, showing the two-story base expression, showing the articulation of the windows that would be allowable per code on that west elevation that would look out toward Wisconsin Avenue. You see the projection of that lobby base, or that lobby entrance, signifying the location of the entrance to the building and creating an element that's at a scale even lower than the two-story base of the building and similar in scale to the entries that occur on the existing buildings. We'll go quickly through the plan. We are proposing maxing out the height at 70 feet because of the entrance to the building located at the northeast corner. That does mean the ground floor of the building will require a step down in order to get the stories of height and work with the grading. The garage entrance, there's one level of below grade parking. The garage entrance has been located with a new curb cut at the northeast corner of the project. That is the low point of the grade on the site, which does allow for the most efficient ramping and access down into the garage. This is the more technical diagram of what's been proposed for site access, including potentially a loading zone on Avondale Street. We have proposed widening the existing right away and the cartway dimension. So the building, the base of the building is set back 20 feet from the new curb line and would have been approximately 23 feet from the existing curb line. But Avondale is a very narrow street that has some challenges with parking on both sides as is currently existing. And so in order to create the functional width of the street, we have been proposing widening, and we've been looking at alternate configurations of how parking would occur and the extent of that street widening, how that would occur as part of this development. The second floor of the building, the lobby is proposed as a two-story space with some residential amenity overlooking that fairly modest lobby. And then you do have units that are 7 units that are wrapping on the building on the east and south sides. And then the typical floor is the third floor illustrates the first floor of setback above that two-story base, but the plan is consistent with the typical floors above 4 through 7. We are also proposing a small amenity space with terrace access for the residents of the building. One of the things that we looked very closely at was the orientation of that amenity space and the access. Typically, we'd be striving to provide some south access and terrace space, but the reality is that the Chevy Chase towers almost permanently shade the south roof deck. That there is the views we felt were better to the north in this scenario. And so that's currently how we've oriented that. And then an overall roof plan showing the extent of enclosed penthouse, open mechanical penthouse, and then the proposal for green roof on the remainder of the roof. And that is the extent of our presentation. So thank you all for your time, and we're anxious to hear your comments and questions.
This is Damon on the panel. This is what an interesting and small little site you have here. I'll start with probably a question that's on everyone's mind. Did the development group look to assemble additional properties here, and were you unsuccessful in achieving that goal?
Kevin, why don't you jump in on that one?
So we have approached formally with the adjacent property owners. They weren't not interested in selling. Obviously, we wanted to assemble additional lots to make the property more scalable. But I mean, we have approached it a couple of times, but they were not interested.
Yeah, no, I expected that answer. I mean, it's particularly that property that's closer to Wisconsin. Yeah, just because if this project moves forward, the redevelopment potential for that particular property is almost extinct unless it were to be assembled with a Pumphrey funeral home. So just had that initial question there.
I think unfortunately on this project, I think that the master plan probably got it wrong. I mean, it looks to a street as not a space, but it looks to a street as a dividing line between the mass that would be on one side and the mass that would be on the other side. And both of those are completely different. And I think it's very unfortunate, and you guys are stuck right in the middle of it. That said, I think that I think there's a couple of issues. One, I think it was talked about a little bit earlier prior to this meeting, but what occurred with the discussions with the property to your south and the use of the alley as a means to access service or parking for your building. Have you guys had any further discussions with them?
This is Suli Cho with Miller and Canby. We have not yet had a chance to sit down with BF Sol to have that conversation, but we anticipate doing so shortly. We did get that comment from the DRC committee meeting that was held just a couple weeks ago. So we are intending to follow through and investigate that. Although our initial brief conversation on the phone didn't seem to indicate a high likelihood that, there's going to be a path forward in that regard. But nonetheless, we're going to pursue it with a more extended conversation.
This is Carl Dupuy. I want to ask you about a coordinated ground plan. You need an urban design for the entire, north side the south side of the street. Pushing and pulling each of the properties as they get developed is going to create, a non-coordinated plan. So to me, it seems imperative that the first developers who are going to take advantage of this windfall should set the tone for a streetscape. And right now, the ground floor plan certainly does not indicate a coordinated, attitude about, urban design. I totally agree with Paul that this is really unfortunate that we have a street as divider between two different zones, as opposed to a street as a uniter, where both sides of the street are talking to each other, etc. So that's a tough job to fulfill, the relationship between, the north side and the south side of this particular street, which is dead end after all. The idea of trying to make gestures to existing two-story buildings, which will be gone in my lifetime, that's for sure, seems really counterintuitive. So I think you have to design a building that is holistic and complete in itself. I share Darren's idea that this is, fragmented, ownership is really problematic. I mean, leaving one parcel toward Wisconsin as non-developed seems really, really counterintuitive. So I'm really conflicted with this project. I think you've tried hard to address a whole bunch of issues, but I really am looking for a much more coordinated idea of what this street could be like as a whole, and then how your building fits into that urban design.
Yeah, I agree with the comment about the compatibility. I mean, obviously, it's ideal to make this compatible with existing buildings around it. But on the other hand, all these buildings on the street are nearing the end of their useful life. And I think that almost all of these will likely be redeveloped soon. So you also need this design needs to think about what will be here, not what's here today.
Exactly. 100% agreement.
If you take the street type and you look at the zoning on the other side of the street, they're allowing, I guess, 45 feet over there, but this is a neighborhood residential street. Is that correct?
Yeah,
That's correct.
Yeah. So the base height of 2 to 3 stories, it seems to me that, and then these buildings are all 2-story, but they're all 2-story with a pretty prominent roof, and it's the same across the street. I'm wondering whether you start to look at the form to essentially meet the requirements for the neighborhood residential street, 2 to 3 stories. I would suggest you probably want to do 3 stories. And then, and I think the setback is paramount. I think the setback has to be maintained. And so I think this projection of a lobby out into the setback is just like a complete no-no. Because you're gonna, you know, if you're gonna do it, you're gonna see it all the way down that street, and I think that's just it. I think that's a non-starter in a lot of ways, because I think the setbacks on this street are going to be very important, absolutely very important. Because right now you're already in front of all the buildings that are adjacent to you. But I think if there was a little bit more response to that, I think the breaking up of the larger mass into two, I think is helpful, and I think it's more compatible. But you know, it's a very difficult project. I mean, ideally, I know the zoning allows you a lot more, but ideally, it seems to me that if you had you have two essentially 3-story bases, and then you had almost like a single loaded tower set back behind, you know, with essentially the corridor facing that alley and the units facing north. Might be, I mean, it would be more, I think, sympathetic to the neighborhood. But again, it would lose a lot of, you know, you'd be losing some density there.
This is Chow Joy. I agree with a lot of the members' comments. I think it's a very difficult site. And I especially disagree that projecting 5 feet over the build-to line, I think it sets, you know, a bad model for the rest of the project on the streets. I think I like how the building is splitting up to break down the massing, the volume. I do have questions of how do you handle the party wall on the east. I don't think, have you mentioned that in the presentation? I've seen it.
No, so we did not mention that specifically in the presentation. I think we did outline some possible approaches in the application. You know, the party wall condition is you know, obviously a less than ideal scenario. It is something that we kind of felt was necessary in order to make the project viable from a density standpoint. But what we would anticipate is exploring materials and articulation pattern and texture that would give expression to that facade, as opposed to being just a kind of single, you know, uniform blank facade. We have talked about the possibility, you know, potentially of public art expression, though, you know, on that elevation facing kind of down toward the end of a dead end street, it's not very publicly visible. So we don't know, and kind of the idea that future development would likely abut that party wall condition.
That's right.
So I think it's really, the approach would be based on material patterning and texture to create a kind of richness and life on that facade.
I think the building itself is handsome. Personally, I like it. It's a pretty good design. It's just a very challenging site.
So this is Rajendra. I guess I was talking to myself earlier, didn't realize I was on mute. I think all the comments that both Carl and Paul have made are really right on target. I did go down the street last night. I always go and visit the sites before these design reviews. This one got a little postponed because I was out of town. It is interesting. It is a very tight street. It is a good thing you're widening it, because there was a car parked in front of the property in the middle of the street last night, and the street was totally congested. I finally gave up and left. But I think the project, as handsome as some of the articulation is really problematic from a planning point of view.
I also think that I particularly like the upper 4 stories of the building, and how you're split in the middle is working very well. You know, the projecting out lobby in that location seems a little arbitrary. The second is that this base is much more solid than I would have expected it to be. And third, I was wondering if you considered moving the lobby entrance to the slot location and maybe have a projecting canopy or something. I know that's very symmetrical, but there's something about the base as it is drawn that seems to conflict with the rest of the building. But I think you're not far from being.
Yeah, thanks for those comments. You know, it is obviously a very symmetrical plan and expression of the massing. Our first inclination actually was and would have been to put the entrance to the building in that slot in the kind of split between the massing. But there are actually fire access requirements that are driving the location of the lobby to as far north, the main entrance lobby, to as far north as we can possibly get it, for trucks to be able to access the site off of Wisconsin Avenue. And you know, we've been working through this challenge, and the farther, if the trucks have to extend any farther beyond that location to access the lobby, then they're no longer going to be able to back up to access the alley that is in plan west of us to exit Avondale Street because of the dead end condition. It's certainly, I mean, the street itself is challenging from an access standpoint because of that dead end condition. And so this is really, the location of the lobby is really to make the access work. It also, you know, from our perspective, you know, even though it creates an asymmetrical expression, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, it kind of activates that initial corner and puts the entrance, you know, at the point closest to, you know, accessing down, you know, all the amenities of downtown Bethesda. I wish I could say that's what really drove it. That's kind of, you know, some ways post rationalization, but it, you know, it does have that ancillary benefit of kind of a technical requirement driving the location.
And I understand this asymmetry. That's good. I just one last comment. If you're going to do that, then maybe the slot in the center of the first two stories is much bigger and prominent than it needs to be. Maybe having a more continuous or broken up differently base might it'll kill some of the symmetry, which is good.
This is Carl. Look at solving your problem in terms of access for fire safety issues is not going to solve the entire street. And let's be perfectly honest, we have to solve the street first. And so there are going to be projects developed to the east that are going to face the same problem with how do they get to the lobby in order to fight the fires, etc. An urban design for this street has to be established before we can actually have a building that addresses the overall gestalt of the street as opposed to just individual properties, because all of a sudden we're going to get some idiosyncratic buildings and it's going to be like a selection of strange buildings wandering down this cul-de-sac. I really think that there has to be an urban design master plan for this street, and then put the architecture into it that's appropriate. Putting a lobby all because of a fire access is not solving the rest of the street. I like the 2-story base as opposed to the 3. If we had a 3-story base, Paul, then we'd have, you know, our pants would be too high, you know, on this building. And so I you know, I think in terms of some of the massing, it's not inappropriate in terms of the 2-story base. But I'm really a holdout in terms of having an urban design for the entire street, including where the sidewalks are going to be aligned, where there's going to be allowed parking or not, etc. And it seems to me that if you build on a 0 lot line, we're going to have our tower separation issues that we have faced elsewhere, etc. And so there's a question of whether or not we're going to have these as individual developments or whether or not we're going to have, you know, a long continuous wall that is on that side of the street.
Yeah. Well, the other setback that is not being honored is the setback above the base. They're basically halfway. They're proposing that the setback above the base is about half of what is required in the guidelines. I think the guidelines say the step back has to be 15 to 20 feet. I believe they're suggesting about 8 feet. And I think that's another problem.
What is the step back here?
I think they had the section, I think, was it 8 feet or something?
Yeah, so it's 8 feet to the from the base to 4, 5, 6, 7. Level 3 is set back an additional foot to creating that change in plane, and then the split in the building where the split occurs is an additional 3 feet. So yeah, it's where you're right, Paul, that we are proposing a building that is roughly half to 2/3 of what the recommendation is.
And why is that? Is that if you were to fulfill the full 15 feet that's recommended, the units on those top floors would be too squeezed? Is that the problem?
Yeah, that is definitely the driver. It is the plan, the depth of the building in order to get the double-loaded residential condition to work with viable depths of those units. So the additional, let's say 7 feet starts to take some of the real usable depth out of the units, and then at that slot unit starts to really compress it. So it is viability of the residential plan that is driving that that setback dimension.
I mean, this is a question for the architects on the call to consider, but I mean, maybe, and we're talking about base and a tower here, but this building is only 70 feet. I mean, maybe there's no need for a base at all. Maybe that's the pattern for the remainder of the block to be developed. Just a thought. If we're struggling with this base, yeah.
Well, I can't put my hands on it right now, but there are guidelines set up for specific street types like this. And it'd be interesting to see what those guidelines like. There you go. They're right there.
Yeah, that's it.
Yep.
Yeah, so there's that the step back above the base of 15 to 20 feet that Paul was referring to. The building placement, we're 20 feet from the proposed curb line, which, Carl, to your point, we would anticipate becomes the established curb line for the redevelopment of Avondale Street as a whole. But that 20 feet from that new curb line and approximately 23 from where it currently exists.
So this is Elza. We do have one member of the public who. So we're coming up on the end of our time slot. I wanted to give Sandy, who I think is somewhat familiar with this project, an opportunity to provide any comments as a member of the community. Sandy, did you want to say anything? You may be on mute.
Yeah. No, well, I wasn't planning to, but I have heard everything, and I understand. It is a complicated challenge with the divided street and the zoning and the urban design guidelines. But I think, maybe a compromise is to have a total 7-story building without the projection and just get a common line for the development for the whole thing. I think you still have to be able to get double-loaded units to make this viable at all. And, we just don't have control over urban design of the entire street and a dead end and how that's going to redevelop. So we were trying to meet with the guidelines that were in place right now. And I think Brett's done a great job of on the massing and trying to make it 2 smaller buildings. I think we could look again, maybe about how they can deal with the lobby, and maybe they can get it to work in the middle and figure something out with the fire department still. I know they've been spending a lot of time trying to do that previously, and that's what led it to this corner. But I hear you guys saying that you got to think the bigger picture. But I think that, you know, we're trying to work with what was given to us as a palette to, you know, to start from a zoning and urban design to begin with. And who knows whether that single little building to the right will get included in the Pumphrey or not. You know, I know that the client has tried to get that project building and it didn't work. So this is what we're left with. But I think I appreciate all your comments. I think they're very good. But there are also a lot of constraints from the client's perspective as well. So hopefully it'll, you know, we'll work more and move forward and try to work out some of these concerns you have. But I think appreciate all your comments.
Thanks. Thank you for that. So, you know, I think as mentioned in the staff memo, you know, from a staff perspective, we have significant reservations about how compatible the design is with the street and how it meets the design guidelines. I think recognizing that, you know, it's a constrained site, but every site is constrained. And, you know, so from the staff perspective, we think it needs more work, and we've provided that direction as part of our DRC comments. At this point, before I ask for next steps, are there any other comments from the panel? So hearing none, I think, you know, there's been a lot of discussion about the base, about the height of the base, how far it extends, with the entrance enclosure towards the street, you know, with regard to the step back at the upper levels. There's also been comment that was similar to I want to say the 7,000 Wisconsin Avenue project, where sort of taking a look at sort of the expected urban design for the rest of the block as it will inform this building. I think that was an important consideration on that project, and I think that it's also an important consideration on this project. So the panel, now this is at sketch plan, has two options. You know, the standard that's to be met is 10 design excellence points, you know, regardless of the context of the site. And the panel, I think if the panel thinks that the project is on track to, you know, meet them at site plan with the guidance that the panel has provided already, then the panel can make that straw vote. Alternatively, the panel can ask the applicant to revisit some of the issues that have been raised in terms of the urban design and the building massing, and see the project again. What's the sense of the panel?
My recommendation is to see the project again.
I agree.
I agree.
Agree here as well.
I agree.
Yeah.
Okay. So does the applicant feel like they have sufficient direction? Are there additional questions or clarifications that the applicant team would like to get beyond the ones the panel has mentioned? And again, we'll be publishing notes, and of course the recording will be available. Does the applicant team have any questions they want to ask right now regarding the design?
I actually have one. This is Suli Cho.
Go ahead.
In terms of the one comment about, taking a look at the urban design of the street and taking, assisting with developing a more holistic view and solution. There was also a comment about maybe, for the height of the building that we're talking about along here, the need for the base may or may not, need to continue. Do we have, if we were to undertake such an endeavor, do we have that ability to even look at whether a building without a separate base might make sense in the context of the street?
I mean, I think you certainly have I think, staff on the panel encourages options. So
Right.
I don't think
Well,
I would make it your
just-
only option,
I asked that.
but certainly.
I asked
Yeah.
that question because of the design guidelines. They talk about a 2 to 3 story base and all of that. So in a lot of ways, what you're looking at that's been developed has been trying to stay as true or, in line with those concepts as much as possible, with deviations that we felt were necessary and appropriate in light of, the complexity of the street and the context that we're dealing with. I'm hearing that, in particular, the 8-foot step back is just not enough. And then, so it's really hard for the applicant to pinpoint which direction. I think might be difficult for us to figure out how to go if the majority is to keep a base. But if it's not, on the necessary to keep the base, then that sort of opens the options further. So I think I would like some more clear direction on that point.
I'm not sure, Damon, what were you suggesting if there wasn't a base that what is currently the base would be pushed back to essentially the mass that's above? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, I mean, that's, I think, where my head was going there, and maybe I shouldn't have suggested that. I'm sorry for the confusion, Sue. So generally, yeah, you're right. The design guidelines call for a base and a tower, and with a step back between the two. But there are some alternative treatments for that, and particularly with buildings that are lower than, I want to say, like 80 or 90 feet. So I think, if there was a good design solution that didn't include a base, I think the panel might be receptive to that. But I also don't want to confuse it. So it just sounded like there was a lot of issues with this base, and particularly how close it was to the street. So maybe if you push the base back and just did away with it, is what I was thinking, and maybe that solves the urban form problem for this site and the rest of the block. But again, that's probably something that the architects really need to dig into, not a developer on the panel.
Well, I think you could still, you could articulate a base, without projecting it 8 feet proud of the rest of the massing. And I don't think there's one answer. I mean, in a way, you're sort of trading one deviation for another, in that you're increasing your setback, your building setback from the curb. And, so the step back between the base and the upper level becomes a bit of a different question. But I think these are options that you are free to explore if they might provide, an alternative for at least folks to look at. And from a massing perspective, maybe it's not that difficult to put together as an option.
Yeah, I think if you look at that axon on the upper left, if you cut the base back, then your build to line is more or less in line with the existing buildings, which might solve that problem. And you can articulate a base without having a projection. So it seems to me that that's certainly within, manageable exploration to look at. Not a projected base, but a base that is articulated within plane of that build line.
Mhm.
On the
Yeah.
other, is a build-to line important for future development of this area?
Yeah, because then you're setting a tone for what the street could be. And I really think that the whole sidewalk and parking arrangements and curb cuts and everything all have to be sort of planned out so that these fire trucks, which of course are humongous, can actually navigate down to access these, this gigantically long cul-de-sac.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is, I mentioned 7,000 Wisconsin Avenue, but in a way, this is also similar to the Battery Lane District project there at the north end of Bethesda, where, before we started looking at what all these buildings were going to be, we asked the applicant to come up with sort of a vision of what the street is, to sort of help set the context. And, I don't think that's something that staff keyed on for the DRC comments, but I think just like Battery Lane, it's essential for creating this vision of what this dead end street's going to be in the future, and then how your design fits into it. I think that's a really good suggestion to do for the next presentation.
Yeah, and frankly, the team internally, we have done that. I don't think we felt we had anything, we didn't develop to the extent that it was something that we could present as a street-wide, design. But what you're seeing in terms of how our building has been sided, where the sidewalk is, all of those things have been very intentionally determined and thought through with the idea of what the anticipated street of Avondale will ultimately be, including the widening of it, where the parking will likely be on, one side for the interim condition, and ultimately maybe, not having parking on the street. So we have begun that, and I think we just didn't take it to the next level, to the point of being able to present it. But I don't want the panel to walk away thinking that this building has been designed without, the development team, thinking through those issues. Those were very much at the forefront of our effort.
Good.
Yeah. So we'll need to wrap it up to get the next item started, but we will coordinate with the applicant team to find another date. I think July is the next DAP session, and so we can see, if the that's probably 2 weeks for you to work on the submission. But we'll coordinate with you to get you back on the agenda. So the direction of the panel is to see the project again. We've talked about the issues. We'll have the notes out. The recordings will be online shortly. And we thank you for presenting today. This concludes this session for the Avondale